listening to the Labor Notes podcast, the weekly show from Labor Notes on rank-and-file news and organizing tactics. I'm your pod co-host, Danielle Smith, and an organizer on our training team.
And I'm pod co-host, Natasha Elena Ullman. Thanks for joining us. We're talking today about grocery workers and their union, the United Food and Commercial Workers, better known as the UFCW. The UFCW has been in the midst of some transformative forces internally over the past few years, and some of its members and locals have been at the forefront of important fights and strikes.
And reformers at the UFCW have been in motion lately. They brought resolutions at the last convention in 2023 to have one member, one vote in elections for top officers. They've also sued the International over how larger locals actually get proportionally fewer delegates to represent them. And many of the more active members and locals have mounted serious contract campaigns and walked out during busy shopping periods.
Most recently, there's also been a leadership change at the UFCW that came about in an interesting way. We have our coworker, Lisa Shu, who has been covering grocery workers, here with us today to tell us more. Lisa wrote a great piece this month about longtime UFCW president Mark Perrone retiring and Milton Jones, who was the international secretary-treasurer, taking over as president. It's up right now on labornotes.org, but you can also read the piece in the June issue of the Labor Notes magazine. Thanks for being here, Lisa.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Let's start with the big picture. What do you think are some of the most important stakes of the grocery workers' fight, and why should union members be paying attention to what's happening within the UFCW?
Great question. Let me try to break this down in a few different ways. So this is my beat at Labor Notes, and it's an exciting one because the UFCW is one of the biggest unions in the U.S. It's actually the second largest private sector union with over 1.2 million members. A lot of people don't know that. It's almost as big as the Teamsters. And the reform movement in the UFCW, which we'll talk about, calls the union the sleeping giant because it flies under the radar, but not in a good way. It's because at best, much of the leadership in the union has been asleep at the wheel, and sometimes there are leaders that are actually outright corrupt. And in many locals, they seem to prefer that their membership be asleep as well. And so if we had a rejuvenated UFCW from top to bottom with active leadership and an active shop floor, the whole U.S. labor movement could look very different. And UFCW members are in every community. We have grocery workers, meatpacking workers all across the U.S. So we need the same kind of transformation in the UFCW that we've seen in the UAW and the Teamsters. So this is starting to change, as we alluded to at the beginning. So for one, there's a group of more progressive local unions in the western U.S., in Washington, Colorado, and Southern California. They're taking a more militant and coordinated approach to bargaining and organizing their members. These locals alone cover between 70 to 100,000 workers in Kroger's and Albertsons. And they're actually going to be taking strike votes at the same time in early June. So you might be hearing more about that soon in the pages of Labor Notes as well. And this coordination across the locals is important because there's actually no master agreement for workers that work for the same employer, like there is in the UAW or the Teamsters, which greatly reduces the union's leverage. The UFCW actually negotiates hundreds of separate local agreements with the same employer. Without coordinated bargaining, we're leaving a lot of worker power on the table. And in fact, and I'll come back to this later, members of Local 700 in Indiana, who are not part of this West Coast coordinated bargaining, just voted down their contract offer, which was significantly worse than the agreements that are being bargained in the West right now, with starting wages being $5 an hour lower in some cases. So there's also going to be a forthcoming Labor Notes article about this as well. So all of this is a historic development for the UFCW. Employers like Kroger and Albertsons, who tried to merge last year but were defeated by the same coalition of UFCW locals, are some of the biggest companies in the U.S., and they're aggressively coordinating, and workers need to do the same. And then the last thing I'll say is grocery workers are fighting for many of the same demands that we're seeing in other parts of the labor movement, particularly around living wages and understaffing, against tiers for health and safety issues. And they're also fighting for their customers and the greater common good. Understaffing hurts customers everywhere, and corporate consolidation has hurt community access to groceries and medication.
You mentioned some reform currents within the union. Could you walk us through some of those dynamics within the UFCW?
Yeah, definitely. So it's an interesting dynamic because, as I said, you have these local unions with more progressive or reform-minded leadership. And you also have a movement in parallel that's kind of bubbling from below, amplifying many of the same demands. With regard to local union leaders, the Coordinated Bargaining Coalition includes Local 3000 in Washington, which is the largest local in the UFCW, Local 7 in Colorado, and Local 770 and Local 324 in Southern California. As I mentioned, they also joined forces to oppose the $25 billion merger of Kroger and Albertsons, which the Department of Justice struck down just this past December. So those two companies alone are two of the largest supermarket retailers in the U.S. and have a combined national market share of 36%. This Stop the Merger campaign, which you can still see online, www.nogrocerymerger.com, put together research to show how harmful this would be to workers and customers, and they work closely with the FTC on the successful complaint in court. They also fund joint research, which you should definitely check out. For instance, a few years ago, they released a paper showing how dismal living conditions are for grocery workers. And just this past month, they released another paper on the consequences of deliberate understaffing in Kroger and Albertsons, which is called Bullies at the Table. So, really interesting to note, this is a group of local unions. They're large unions, but this is not the UFCW International Union, which is not doing any of this. The International Union actually had to be pressured into opposing the merger in the first place. So then separately, but fighting very much along parallel lines, there's also a reform organization called Essential Workers for Democracy, which is building a network of rank-and-file union members across the UFCW to support many of the same goals, like coordinated bargaining, strike readiness, new organizing, as well as union democracy. And this is pretty hard work. We've talked about how fragmented these unions are against their employers. The workers are also very separated by where they work. Each store only has a certain number of UFCW members who are in the same place regularly where they see each other. And members often have to drive for hours to attend local union meetings. So Essential Workers for Democracy is doing the very hard, important work of actually bringing these workers together from across the UFCW. So we mentioned some of their union democracy initiatives include organizing around one member, one vote, and a lawsuit against the UFCW itself regarding the proportional representation of delegates at the UFCW convention, and also something called ex officio selection of delegates, which is when officers who have already been elected are automatically appointed to be delegates instead of holding a separate election. And then just requiring locals to have delegate elections at all. Essential Workers for Democracy also has a big focus on member education and skill building. They brought a large group of members to Labor Notes Conference in 2024. They've been running a lot of organizing workshops for workers online and in person. But I want to highlight that some of the most important work they've done lately is around supporting contracts and bargaining. So this includes a lot of strike support they did for members of Local 7 in Colorado who went on strike in February. And also they've been supporting coordinated bargaining by connecting bargaining committee members with each other from across locals to share important lessons in person and online. And then, as I mentioned before, there are 8,000 Kroger workers in Local 700 in Indiana who just voted down their contract by 74%. And Essential Workers for Democracy has been supporting them as well. So they're building up a lot of momentum.
So that brings us to the most recent story that you wrote about the change in leadership at the top of the UFCW. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so the UFCW, as of last month, has a new president, Milton Jones, who was previously the International Secretary Treasurer, which is the number 2 spot in the UFCW. So he was chosen in a special meeting of the 55-person International Executive Board, a meeting which took place last month. And What's interesting is that the union didn't make any official announcement that the previous president, Mark Perone, was planning to retire until this vote actually happened. So it was presented as a fait accompli to the membership, most of whom had no idea this was happening. So this is a fairly undemocratic way of making a leadership change, and it speaks to the problems in the union we've been talking about. And what's interesting, and I didn't know this is how every previous president of the UFCW has been chosen in the past. In theory, they're supposed to be elected by delegates at convention, but the president always retires between conventions. The board appoints their successor, who then has a few years to cement their position, and then they get voted on to, their next term at convention. So the union's conventions happen every 5 years. The last one was in 2023. The next will be in 2028. As we've discussed, unlike in the UAW, the Teamsters, the UFCW doesn't have direct member elections, but even their delegate voting system is hardly working the way it's supposed to.
That's pretty damning. Was there any kind of effort at any contests at all?
Well, there was no open contest and, hardly any transparency, but there was actually an interesting dynamic this time where, for the first time, the president was not actually elected by acclamation by the board. There were several candidates, and Jones, who was Perone's chosen successor, only narrowly won in the last round, 28 to 25. And we only know this because there was actually a push this time to record the results of the vote, at least internally. And the runner-up candidate was Mark Lauritsen, who is the head of the UFCW's meatpacking division. So there's some debate over what this signifies, but it could point to Perone's successor having somewhat less of an iron grip over the union than Perone seemed to. I also mentioned in the article there was one genuine reform candidate, Todd Crosby, the former international organizing director of the UFCW, who was also the only one to publicly announce his campaign. He's currently a staffer for Local 3000, one of the reform-minded locals we spoke about, and a key figure in some of these important campaigns against Kroger and Albertsons. So Essential Workers for Democracy did have a presidential candidate forum on the eve of Perone's retirement. The only candidate who agreed to attend was Crosby, although they invited all of them. And Essential Workers for Democracy was also the only group that put out any kind of public notice about Perone's retirement before he announced it. So Crosby did use the candidate forum to amplify the demands of reform-minded members. He called for the UFCW to invest more in new organizing, coordinate national bargaining with common employers, and for member democracy in the union, including one member, one vote. So Crosby obviously didn't win, but I think all of this means we should continue to keep a close eye on how the reform movement develops between now and 2028, when the UFCW has its next convention.
So, we've been talking mainly about grocery, but the UFCW also represents hundreds of thousands of meatpacking workers in addition to grocery workers. The union's actually formed out of a merger of grocery workers and meatpacking workers in 1979. Can you tell us a little bit about what's been going on in the meatpacking side of the union?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Meatpacking organizing is really important, but also really challenging. It's a very diverse, very vulnerable workforce, mostly workers of color and lots of immigrant workers and refugees. The meatpacking industry has seen a really steep decline in union density since the end of World War II, when it had about 90% union density, and as of 2020, union density stands around 18%. There are also incredible health and safety challenges, also some prominent cases of child labor even. Most people probably know there was a major disaster with COVID outbreaks during the pandemic in many meatpacking plants. And this is another sector that's very closely tied, with our food supply chain and the health and safety of the greater community. And similar to grocery, there's been a lot of corporate consolidation. So, some of the same challenges with bargaining also hold in the meatpacking sector of the UFCW. One thing I'll highlight is that there's been an interesting recent development in that the UFCW negotiated a national contract with JBS, a Brazilian company, which is one of the biggest meat packers in the world. And it actually established a new Taft-Hartley pension plan for the 26,000 workers covered under the contract. This is of interest, I think, to a lot of people in the labor movement. Workers at the Big Three in the UAW, members of the Machinists Union at Boeing have tried so far unsuccessfully to win back defined benefit pension plans for new members or to get their employers to unfreeze existing pension plans. So I'm working on a story about this for Labor Notes. And the contract also won some improvements on line speed regulation, paid sick time, and a few other things. Although I should note, JBS is a terrible company. They have a long list of corruption charges against them and environmental violations in Brazil. And interestingly, they were the single biggest donor to Trump's inauguration committee, which made headlines a few months back. So definitely an interesting development.
Well, thanks, Lisa, for coming on and sharing that. It is nice to hear about some stirrings from the sleepy giant, as you said. That's our episode for this week. Again, you can read Lisa's story in the June issue of the Labor Notes magazine. If you don't already, you can subscribe to the magazine for an annual rate of $30 and get 11 issues delivered to your door over the year. Also, consider supporting our work. Our fundraiser drive at Labor Notes is still going on, which means your contributions can go twice as far if you donate now, thanks to a group of Labor Notes supporters who are ready to match your support up to $13,450.
Regular donations are how we sustain this work. The reporting, the Troublemakers schools, the workshops, the conferences, and even this podcast. Become a monthly donor or make a one-time donation at labornotes.org/donate.
Before we sign off, we've got some upcoming events you might be into. If you live around Oakland, California, don't miss the Bay Area Troublemaker School on Saturday, June 14th. It'll be an all-day, in-person mini conference where you can learn or sharpen basic organizing skills and meet active union members. And we have our Secrets of a Successful Organizer online workshops coming up in June on Mondays, June 16th, 23rd, and the 30th. This month's Stewards Workshop on the topic of maintaining unity in an open shop is on Wednesday, June 25th. You can find more details about all these events and more on labornotes.org/events.
Please rate us or leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. If you're listening to us on Podbean at labornotespodcast.podbean.com, download our episode. The Labor Notes Podcast is produced by Daniel Smith, Sindhu Sundar, and myself. Our title music was written and performed by Labor Notes Labor Climate Organizer Keith Brower Brown. See you next week. Solidarity, y'all.